Rude Mouthy Chav calls the king's guard. A sausage tries to fight me gets handcuffed. Tourists wandered about, cameras in hand, snapping photos of the majestic guards standing motionless at attention, their tall bearskin hats casting long shadows in the sunlight. Local residents hurried past on their daily errands, their conversations blending into a low hum of urban life. The air carried the faint scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery and the subtle perfume of blooming flowers from a small garden tucked behind a stone wall. The protagonist, a calm and observant person, had chosen this day for a peaceful walk. They loved wandering through busy streets, enjoying the mix of noise and quiet moments, watching the world move around them. Today, the plan was simple. Stroll past the palace, admire the guards, and maybe find a quiet cafe to rest in afterward. With each step, the protagonist felt a sense of contentment, noticing small details that most people overlooked. The way pigeons flitted between benches, or the soft rustle of leaves overhead as a gentle breeze passed by. But amid this ordinary day, the atmosphere was about to shift. From down the street, a loud, unmistakable voice cut through the usual city noise. It was rough, brash, and carried a tone that immediately drew attention. The young man, known in the area for his mouthy and careless behavior, strode down the street with a swagger that seemed to challenge anyone in his path. His clothes were casual, slightly worn, and he moved with an overconfidence that often irritated people around him. People glanced his way, some stepping aside to avoid interaction, while others shook their heads, silently muttering about his reckless energy. As he approached the row of guards standing perfectly still at their posts, something in the young man seemed to snap. He stopped abruptly in front of one of the soldiers, and his eyes sparkled with mischief. He opened his mouth and, without hesitation, shouted a word meant to insult. He called the guard a sausage. The sound of the insult echoed sharply against the stone walls of the palace, drawing a few startled gasps from nearby pedestrians. Some tourists froze mid-photo, unsure whether they had heard correctly, while others quietly chuckled at the audacity. The protagonist, standing only a few steps away, could not help but be drawn into the scene. The boldness of the act was almost unbelievable. How could someone disrespect a royal guard so openly in such a public place? There was a moment of tension as the young man looked around, clearly expecting someone to react. His expression was a mix of defiance and amusement, and it was clear he thrived on the shock he caused. The crowd began to grow as people stopped to watch, sensing that something unusual was happening. Phones were raised discreetly, recording the unfolding spectacle. Despite the attention, the guard remained calm and composed. Years of training had prepared him for this exact type of situation. His posture did not change, and his face remained expressionless. In many ways, his stillness was more powerful than any response the young man could give. But the young man was not deterred. He took a step closer, as if to challenge the guard personally, his voice rising with each word. There was an undeniable tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The protagonist felt a flutter of nervousness. Something told them this encounter could escalate quickly if no one intervened. The protagonist considered stepping forward to say something, maybe even calm the young man down, but instinctively they hesitated. The unpredictability of the situation made anyone's involvement risky. The young man was unpredictable, his behavior reckless, and the protagonist knew that one wrong word could make things worse. Instead, they observed quietly, noting every detail. The sharpness in the young man's eyes, the faint tremble in his hands, the subtle way the guard's fingers rested near his belt, ready but controlled. Meanwhile, the young man's frustration seemed to grow. He muttered under his breath and kicked at a nearby trash can, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Pedestrians shuffled around him cautiously, unwilling to get too close, yet unable to ignore the scene entirely. There was a sense of theater in his actions, a performance meant to attract attention and assert dominance. The protagonist felt a mixture of irritation and fascination. It was like watching a live play unfold on the city streets, complete with tension, humor, and unpredictable turns. Then something unexpected happened. The young man turned abruptly toward the protagonist, his gaze sharp and challenging. It was as though he sensed a quiet observer nearby and decided to confront them personally. He stepped closer, his voice loud and confrontational, asking why the protagonist was staring. The question was more a provocation than a request for information. The crowd around them began to notice, forming a loose semicircle that made the scene feel even more public. The protagonist's heart rate quickened. They were not looking for trouble, yet trouble had found them. They took a measured step back, raising their hands slightly to indicate they meant no harm. But the young man ignored this, his energy charged with the reckless confidence of youth. Every movement he made seemed designed to draw attention, to provoke a reaction, to test boundaries. The protagonist realized that this encounter was about more than just the insult to the guard. It was a display of bravado, a way for the young man to assert himself in a world that he often felt invisible in. For a moment, the street fell into a tense silence. Even the city's usual noises seemed to fade as everyone watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The protagonist considered leaving, walking away quietly to avoid escalation, but something made them pause. They felt a mix of curiosity and responsibility. Perhaps stepping away would allow the young man's behavior to spiral further, and the protagonist wanted to see how this would resolve without intervention, how the trained guard would handle the situation, and whether the young man would finally face consequences for his actions. The young man's energy began to shift again, frustration mixed with impatience, and he took another step closer. He opened his mouth, preparing another insult, his tone now edged with anger. The protagonist could sense the danger in the air. The crowd murmured nervously, some taking a few steps back, unsure of whether to stay or flee. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Something significant was about to happen, and everyone present could feel it. Throughout all this, the guard remained composed. His posture was steady, his eyes focused, and there was no visible sign of anger or fear. The protagonist admired this level of discipline, realizing how difficult it must be to maintain calm when faced with such open disrespect. The young man, however, seemed oblivious to the discipline in front of him, driven only by the desire to make a scene and assert himself in front of strangers. Finally, after a long moment that felt like hours, the young man flared up fully. His frustration boiled over, and he took a stance that clearly indicated he was ready to escalate further. The protagonist's mind raced. They had witnessed many strange situations in public spaces, but nothing quite like this. The young man was testing limits, and the guard, trained to handle provocations without loss of control, was the perfect foil. The tension between the reckless energy of youth and the disciplined professionalism of authority created a powerful, almost cinematic, scene. As the young man's voice rose and his gestures became more dramatic, the protagonist remained rooted to the spot. They noticed every small detail, the way his shoes scuffed against the pavement, the sharp movements of his hands, the slight tremor in his jaw. All of these small signs hinted at the deeper mix of emotions beneath his bluster: insecurity, anger, and a desire to be seen. Meanwhile, the guard's calm stance contrasted sharply, highlighting the difference between impulsive behavior and measured control. The crowd continued to gather, a mixture of locals, tourists, and curious passers-by. Whispers and quiet laughter rippled through them as people speculated about what might happen next. Some reached for their phones, capturing images and videos, knowing that this unusual confrontation would be talked about later. The protagonist, however, focused entirely on the present, observing with both concern and fascination. And so, the stage was set. The young man, full of bravado and reckless energy, faced the silent, disciplined guard with the protagonist caught in the middle. The air was thick with anticipation, every moment stretching with the tension of what might come next. Something significant was about to unfold, and everyone present felt it instinctively. It was a moment where ordinary life collided with the unexpected, a reminder that even the most routine days can hold extraordinary events. The young man, full of energy and loud words, seemed determined to make his presence felt. The air around him crackled with his restless energy, and the crowd, sensing that something unusual was about to happen, edged closer to watch. The protagonist remained near the outskirts of the gathering, observing quietly, trying not to draw attention while keeping their eyes on the unfolding situation. For a moment, the young man paused, as if gathering his thoughts, and then he looked directly at the protagonist. His gaze was sharp, curious, and challenging all at once. He seemed almost surprised that someone was watching him without being intimidated. It was as if he had expected everyone to be either scared or impressed by his loud words and bold actions. The protagonist, sensing the shift, straightened slightly and met his gaze calmly. This small act, simple as it was, seemed to provoke the young man even more. He stepped closer, his movements full of exaggerated confidence. "What are you looking at?" he demanded, his tone loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. The words were more a challenge than a question. The protagonist took a careful step back, trying to show that they had no intention of fighting or arguing. Yet the young man seemed determined to draw a reaction, as if testing the protagonist's composure. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to murmur quietly. Some people whispered advice to each other, suggesting that it might be safer to move along, while others leaned in, curious to see what would happen next. There was a strange mix of excitement and anxiety in the air, a combination of the young man's audacity and the calm restraint of the protagonist. Every small movement, every glance, seemed magnified by the gathering audience. The young man's voice rose again, this time sharper, more insistent. "Say something. Are you scared of me?" he challenged, trying to force a response. The protagonist remained quiet, letting the young man's words hang in the air. Silence, in this case, was a strategy, a way to avoid escalating the situation while also showing that the young man's attempt to provoke was not working. Frustration flashed across the young man's face. He stomped his foot lightly, muttering under his breath, and kicked at the edge of the pavement. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. He was impatient, craving attention, and frustrated that the protagonist was not reacting as he had hoped. The crowd noticed this shift, sensing that the young man's energy was moving from playful provocation to something more serious, though not violent. The protagonist began to scan the surroundings carefully. The street was busy, but not overly crowded, giving enough space to step back if needed. Nearby, the guards remained steady and composed, their watchful eyes following every move. The protagonist noticed a subtle signal from one of the guards, a slight adjustment of posture, suggesting that they were ready to act if the situation escalated further. It was a quiet reminder that authority was present, a calm yet firm force against the young man's reckless energy. The young man, however, seemed oblivious to the silent warnings around him. His attention was fully on the protagonist, and his frustration was growing. "Don't just stand there like a statue. Talk to me," he shouted, his voice echoing across the street. Some members of the crowd flinched at the sudden volume, while others smiled at the absurdity of the situation. The protagonist could feel their heart beating faster, not out of fear, but from the intensity of the moment. Then, unexpectedly, the young man raised his hands slightly, as if preparing to do something more dramatic. The crowd tensed, unsure of what might happen next. It was clear that he was testing boundaries, trying to see how far he could push before someone reacted. The protagonist stayed calm, taking deep breaths and keeping a steady stance. Every instinct told them to remain collected, to avoid giving the young man any satisfaction from a visible reaction. At this point, a few bystanders began to step closer, speaking quietly among themselves. "Do you think he'll actually do something?" one whispered. Another shook their head. "I don't know, but he's asking for trouble," someone else replied. The atmosphere was charged with curiosity and mild apprehension. People wanted to witness the drama, yet everyone was aware that the young man's behavior was unusual and unpredictable. The young man, clearly frustrated by the lack of response from the protagonist, began pacing a small circle, muttering words under his breath. He gestured wildly with his hands, trying to express his emotions without losing the attention of the crowd. It was a performance, and he seemed to feed off the reactions of those watching. The protagonist observed carefully, noting the rhythm of his movements, the expressions of his face, and the patterns in his speech. Every small detail helped them understand the young man's personality, bold, restless, and craving recognition. Suddenly, he stopped pacing and faced the protagonist once more. "You think you're better than me, huh?" he demanded, his voice both loud and challenging. The protagonist, keeping calm, shook their head slightly, signaling that there was no rivalry here. This simple gesture seemed to confuse him for a moment, as he was expecting a strong reaction, either anger or fear. The protagonist's calmness acted as a mirror, reflecting the young man's own restlessness back at him without confrontation. The guard, noticing that the young man was focused entirely on the protagonist, took a quiet step closer. Their movement was measured, almost imperceptible, but it added a subtle layer of authority to the situation. The young man glanced briefly at the guard, realizing that his boldness was being quietly monitored. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged it off, thinking that the protagonist was his main target for attention. The tension continued to build, with the crowd forming a larger semicircle around the scene. Some people took out their phones, capturing photos and videos, while others simply watched in awe. The young man's energy was now at a peak. His movements were more exaggerated, his words louder, and his attempts to provoke a response more deliberate. The protagonist, however, remained composed, resisting the urge to react emotionally. At one point, the young man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a mock whisper meant to be heard by the protagonist alone. "You think you can ignore me?" "You can't," he said, his tone both challenging and frustrated. The crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that this was a turning point. The protagonist, however, maintained their calm demeanor, not giving him the reaction he desired. The young man's frustration grew, and he stepped back, trying to regain a sense of control over the situation. He glanced at the crowd, noticing the mixture of amusement and concern on their faces. Some were whispering to each other, others were laughing quietly, and a few were shaking their heads in disbelief. The young man's energy seemed almost contagious. It pulled people in, making them watch closely, yet also making them aware of the tension in the air. As the minutes passed, the young man's attempts to provoke the protagonist became more elaborate. He waved his arms, stomped his feet, and even made exaggerated facial expressions, all in an effort to elicit a reaction. The protagonist observed everything carefully, noting the patterns in his behavior. It was clear that he was looking for attention, trying to test boundaries, and enjoying the drama he was creating. Meanwhile, the guards continued to monitor the situation quietly. Their presence alone was a stabilizing force, ensuring that the young man's energy did not spiral out of control. The protagonist realized that the calm authority of the guards contrasted sharply with the young man's chaotic energy, creating a balance in the unfolding scene. At one point, the young man took a deep breath and shouted again, louder than before. The crowd flinched slightly, and a few bystanders moved back. The protagonist, however, did not flinch. Instead, they took a careful step to the side, maintaining composure while creating a small space between themselves and the young man. This subtle movement, simple as it was, seemed to frustrate him further. He muttered under his breath, pacing in a small circle once more. His gestures were frantic, his energy restless. The protagonist continued to observe quietly, noting how his behavior reflected a mixture of frustration, impatience, and a desire to assert himself. It was a fascinating study in human behavior, how bold actions and loud words could create tension and draw attention, yet also reveal vulnerability beneath the surface. The crowd continued to watch, some whispering encouragement, others shaking their heads. The young man's energy had become the focal point of the street, drawing attention from every direction. The protagonist, though caught in the middle, remained calm, aware that maintaining composure was the key to navigating this unpredictable encounter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the young man paused. He looked around at the crowd, then back at the protagonist, his chest heaving slightly from the effort of shouting and pacing. There was a brief moment of silence, a pause in the chaos, where everyone seemed to hold their breath. The young man's energy had reached a peak, and the next action he took would determine how the situation unfolded. The protagonist, aware of the moment, stayed calm, maintaining eye contact and a steady stance. It was a delicate balance, remaining composed without provoking further, yet also ready to respond if necessary. The guards, standing nearby, were prepared to intervene, but for now, they remained silent observers, allowing the young man to expend his energy without escalation. In that moment, the street felt suspended in time. The young man's restless energy, the protagonist's calm presence, the crowd's anticipation, and the silent authority of the guards combined to create a scene that felt almost cinematic. Everyone watching knew that something significant was about to happen, even if they did not yet realize what form it would take. The tension on the street had reached a tipping point. The young man, still full of restless energy, had paced and shouted for several minutes, attempting to draw the protagonist into an argument or confrontation. The crowd that had gathered around them watched quietly now, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Every person present seemed to lean slightly forward, their attention fixed on the young man and the calm figure standing before him. The protagonist remained steady, taking deep, controlled breaths to maintain composure. They had learned over the years that keeping calm in tense situations was the most effective way to prevent matters from escalating. While the young man's energy was loud, chaotic, and unpredictable, the protagonist's quiet composure acted as a counterbalance. Each small movement they made, from shifting a foot to adjusting posture, was deliberate and measured, signaling that they had no intention of reacting impulsively. Nearby, the king's guard had been observing the entire encounter with a careful eye. Their training in managing public incidents was extensive, and they knew how quickly situations could change when someone attempted to provoke conflict. Standing tall and silent, the guard's presence alone created a subtle but firm authority. There was no visible anger or impatience in their posture, only readiness and control, and this quiet confidence gradually began to affect the young man, even if he did not yet realize it. The young man, however, was not yet deterred. Frustration and impatience began to creep into his voice as he shouted again, trying to push the protagonist into a response. "Why are you just standing there? Say something," he demanded, his tone sharp and challenging. His words carried through the street, drawing the attention of more passers-by. Some shook their heads at his behavior, while others whispered to one another, discussing what might happen next. The protagonist, however, remained silent, letting the young man's words hang in the air without giving them weight. This calmness seemed to confuse and frustrate him further. He glanced toward the guard again, noticing for the first time the unwavering posture and quiet authority. There was a flicker of hesitation in his expression. He realized that his attempts to dominate the situation were being observed and carefully managed. For the first time, the young man considered that his bold words might have consequences. Despite this, the young man's energy could not be contained. He began pacing again, muttering to himself in a low, frustrated tone, occasionally raising his voice to make sure the crowd could hear him. The protagonist observed closely, noting the patterns in his behavior. Each movement and word was a way of expressing his frustration and desire for recognition. The young man was not merely being loud. He was performing, creating a spectacle that demanded attention. At that moment, the guard took a subtle step forward. It was almost imperceptible, but it carried a significant message. The situation was being carefully monitored and would be managed if necessary. The young man glanced briefly at the guard, and for a moment, uncertainty crossed his face. He realized that his actions were not entirely without consequence. The presence of authority, silent yet unmistakable, added a layer of seriousness to his performance. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as people speculated about what might happen next. Some shifted slightly to get a better view, while others remained cautious, aware of the tension but unwilling to turn away. The young man's frustration seemed to grow in response to the attention and the subtle restraint of the guard. His energy was restless, his movements exaggerated, and his words more insistent. Yet, despite all this, the protagonist remained calm, their quiet presence a stabilizing force amid the chaos. Suddenly, the young man turned sharply toward the protagonist, his eyes wide with frustration. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, taking a step closer. His voice carried across the street, and a few members of the crowd instinctively stepped back. The protagonist held their ground, keeping a steady stance and calm expression. This simple act of non-reactive confidence seemed to further unsettle the young man. He expected a reaction, whether fear, anger, or frustration, and yet he received none. The guard took another careful step forward, closing the distance slightly without making any sudden movements. Their eyes were fixed on the young man, assessing every twitch of the body and every change in expression. It was a delicate dance. Too much movement could escalate the situation, too little could allow it to spiral. The young man noticed the guard's movement and hesitated, unsure whether to continue his provocations or pause to reassess. For a brief moment, silence fell over the street. The young man's chest heaved slightly as he processed the presence of authority and the calm confidence of the protagonist. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the next action. Even the usual sounds of the city, the distant chatter, footsteps, and faint hum of traffic, felt muted as though everyone present recognized the intensity of this moment. Then, without warning, the young man's frustration boiled over again. He raised his hands, gesturing wildly, and shouted at the protagonist, trying one last time to provoke a response. The protagonist, however, remained composed, meeting the gaze steadily without moving closer or reacting emotionally. The calmness, combined with the quiet authority of the guard, created a clear boundary that the young man could not easily cross. The guard, seeing that the young man was reaching the peak of his frustration, decided it was time to intervene. Moving smoothly and deliberately, they positioned themselves between the young man and the protagonist, maintaining a safe distance while ensuring control over the situation. The young man's eyes flicked to the guard, and for the first time, uncertainty replaced defiance. He realized that his behavior was being actively managed and that continuing to escalate could lead to consequences. The young man's voice trembled slightly as he muttered under his breath, trying to maintain his bravado. The crowd noticed the shift in his demeanor. The exaggerated confidence that had defined his earlier behavior was giving way to a more cautious stance. He still attempted to assert himself, but there was a visible hesitation now, a recognition that his actions were no longer completely unchecked. The protagonist observed all of this carefully. Every subtle shift in posture, every hesitation, and every muttered word was a sign of the young man's internal struggle between defiance and awareness of authority. It was a delicate balance, and the protagonist understood that remaining calm and composed was crucial to preventing further escalation. The guard spoke in a calm but firm voice, addressing the young man directly. Their words were measured and clear, providing guidance without aggression. The young man's body language shifted slightly, indicating that he was listening, even if reluctantly. The presence of authority, combined with the protagonist's composed stance, began to gradually reduce the tension in the air. Despite the guard's intervention, the young man's restlessness remained. He continued to mutter, shift his weight from foot to foot, and gesture with his hands. The crowd, sensing the reduction in tension but still captivated by the drama, remained nearby, watching closely. Some whispered quietly, speculating about what might happen next, while others simply observed in awe at the unfolding scene. The protagonist noticed that the young man's energy was now beginning to wane. His movements were less exaggerated, and his voice, while still loud at times, had lost some of its earlier intensity. The calm authority of the guard, combined with the protagonist's quiet composure, had created a subtle but effective shift in the dynamics of the encounter. Then, with a small sigh, the young man took a step back. He glanced around at the crowd, now more aware of their presence and attention. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that his actions had been both observed and contained. His energy, once wild and chaotic, was now tempered by awareness and the quiet influence of those around him. The guard remained close, maintaining a watchful presence without making any sudden moves. Their steady stance continued to provide a stabilizing force, ensuring that the situation remained under control. The young man, still muttering quietly to himself, appeared to be processing the events of the past several minutes. The protagonist, relieved that the immediate tension had begun to dissipate, remained calm but alert. They knew that the young man's energy could flare again at any moment, but for now, the combination of calm observation, quiet authority, and subtle guidance had created a temporary resolution. The crowd, sensing that the situation had shifted from chaos to control, began to disperse slowly. Some lingered, whispering among themselves about the dramatic events they had just witnessed. Others moved along, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. The young man, now quieter, remained in place, still restless but no longer openly challenging those around him. As the protagonist took a small step back, allowing the guard to maintain control, they reflected on the encounter. It was a powerful reminder of how calm composure, quiet authority, and careful observation could manage even the most unpredictable situations. The young man's energy, while loud and chaotic, had ultimately been contained through patience and measured action rather than confrontation. For the young man, the lesson was subtle but significant. His bold attempts to provoke, while initially commanding attention, had been met with calm resistance and quiet authority. The result was a moment of self-awareness, a realization that energy and loud words alone could not always dominate a situation. The protagonist continued their careful observation, noting how the young man shifted his weight and looked around at the quieting crowd. The tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had been transformed into a quieter, more reflective energy. The young man's actions, once chaotic, were now tempered by awareness and subtle recognition of the presence of authority. The guard remained steadfast, a silent reminder that calm authority could guide and influence behavior without the need for aggression or confrontation. Their presence alone had reshaped the dynamics of the encounter, demonstrating the power of discipline and observation. Finally, the young man's energy, while still restless, had diminished enough that it was clear the immediate escalation had ended. The protagonist, still maintaining composure, allowed themselves a small breath of relief. The situation had been managed, the young man's provocations contained, and the crowd slowly dispersed, returning the street to its usual rhythm. In that quiet aftermath, the protagonist reflected on the unusual encounter. It was a vivid reminder that even ordinary streets could become stages for unexpected drama, and that calm composure and quiet authority were often the most effective tools for navigating unpredictable human behavior. After several minutes of tense standoff, the energy in the began to shift. The young man who had spent so long pacing, shouting, and gesturing wildly was now noticeably quieter. His loud, brash behavior, which had drawn the attention of everyone nearby, had been carefully managed by the calm authority of the king's guard and the composed presence of the protagonist. The crowd, sensing the change in tone, began to settle, some whispering in astonishment about how the situation had unfolded, while others took out their phones to capture the moment for posterity. The protagonist, standing a few steps away, took a deep breath and surveyed the scene. They had watched the young man's bold provocations, observed his restless energy, and maintained a calm, measured stance throughout. Now, with the immediate escalation under control, they could reflect on the absurdity and intensity of what had just transpired. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that by staying calm, they had contributed to preventing further chaos. The young man, realizing that the initial thrill of the confrontation had faded, paused in the middle of the street. His chest heaved slightly from the exertion of shouting and pacing, and his hands rested on his hips as he tried to regain composure. For the first time, he seemed aware of the presence of authority not just as a formality, but as a guiding force. He glanced at the guard, who remained standing tall and composed, silent yet unmistakably observant. The young man's expression flickered with a mixture of frustration and curiosity, as though he was trying to understand why his loud, chaotic behavior had not achieved the results he expected. The guard, noting the young man's hesitation, took a careful step closer. Their movement was deliberate and controlled, designed not to startle, but to signal that further action was necessary if the young man did not respond appropriately. The young man, sensing the shift in energy, muttered under his breath, his earlier bravado tempered by a newfound awareness of the consequences of his actions. The crowd, noticing the guard's measured approach, leaned in slightly, anticipating that the next few moments would determine the outcome of this unusual encounter. The protagonist watched attentively. They understood that the young man's moment of self-awareness was delicate, and that the guard's intervention had to be handled with precision. Any sudden or aggressive move could provoke a reaction, yet allowing him to continue unchecked could lead to further disturbance. The calm, controlled authority of the guard provided a safe boundary within which the young man's energy could be contained and managed. Then, with a quiet but firm voice, the guard addressed the young man directly. "You have created enough disruption here," they said. "It is time to cooperate and follow instructions." The words were simple, clear, and authoritative. They carried no anger, no threat, only the certainty of someone who knew how to manage a tense situation. The young man's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced at the crowd, realizing that his behavior had been witnessed by many. For the first time, there was a hint of embarrassment in his expression, though he was still struggling to fully process it. The crowd's murmurs grew softer as people recognized the shift in the young man's demeanor. Some whispered quietly about how unusual it was to see such a public display of boldness being calmly handled by a professional. Others chuckled quietly, remarking on the audacity of the insult that had started it all. The now famous sausage remark that had set off the entire chain of events. The protagonist smiled faintly, recognizing the humor in the situation while remaining alert to the potential for further escalation. The young man hesitated, then reluctantly extended his hands toward the guard. It was a small but significant gesture, a sign of compliance and recognition that the situation had moved beyond his control. The guard nodded slightly, acknowledging the cooperation while maintaining a watchful stance. The protagonist noticed the subtle tension in the young man's shoulders, the way he shifted his weight, and the occasional glance at the crowd, all signs that he was beginning to accept the reality of the moment. With practiced ease, the guard produced a set of handcuffs. Their movements were calm, precise, and deliberate, reflecting years of training in handling delicate situations. The young man, now fully aware of the seriousness of the encounter, allowed the process to continue without resistance. The crowd watched in quiet fascination as the handcuffs were secured, the sound of the metal clicking into place marking the official end of his attempts to provoke further chaos. The protagonist felt a sense of relief, knowing that the situation had been contained without any physical altercation or harm. The handcuffs, while a symbol of authority, also represented a clear resolution. The young man, whose boldness had dominated the street for several minutes, was now under control, his energy redirected and contained. The crowd's attention gradually shifted from tension to quiet amusement and reflection. As the guard gently guided the young man toward the side of the street, their posture remained calm and professional. The young man, although restrained, seemed to have accepted the situation. There was no yelling, no wild gestures, only the recognition that his actions had consequences and that authority had responded with measured control. The protagonist observed closely, noting how quickly the dynamics had shifted from chaos to order, from tension to calm. The crowd, sensing the resolution, began to disperse slowly. Some continued to watch for a few moments, commenting quietly to each other about the unusual series of events they had witnessed. Others returned to their own errands, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. The street, which had felt alive with chaos and anticipation, gradually returned to its normal rhythm, with the sounds of conversation, footsteps, and traffic filling the air once more. The young man, now walking with the guard, appeared quieter and more reflective. His previous energy, so loud and restless, had been tempered by the clear presence of authority and the calm example set by the protagonist. There was a sense of humility in his movements, a recognition that his behavior had drawn attention but had been managed without aggression or escalation. The protagonist, standing at a respectful distance, considered the lessons of the day. It was a powerful reminder that calmness, patience, and measured observation could effectively manage even the most unpredictable situations. The young man's bold provocations had been a test of patience, both for the protagonist and for the guard, and the way the situation had been handled demonstrated the value of composure and restraint. The guard, maintaining a professional stance, continued to guide the young man toward the nearest police checkpoint. Their movements were deliberate, ensuring that the situation remained controlled while also providing the young man with the opportunity to reflect on his actions. The young man's steps were slower now, and his head occasionally lowered, a subtle sign that he was processing the events of the past several minutes. The protagonist, still observing, noticed how the young man's body language had shifted from defiance to acceptance. His gestures were smaller, his posture less exaggerated, and his tone quieter when he spoke to the guard. The dramatic energy that had dominated the street just moments before had been transformed into a more subdued, reflective state. It was a powerful demonstration of how authority, calmness, and observation could influence behavior without confrontation. As the young man disappeared from sight, guided by the guard, the protagonist finally allowed themselves to relax. The tension that had gripped the street for so long had dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm and normalcy. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving behind only whispers of the unusual events that had unfolded. The protagonist, reflecting on the encounter, recognized the mixture of humor, tension, and human behavior that had made the moment so memorable. In the aftermath, the protagonist continued their walk through the city, noticing small details that had been overshadowed by the earlier drama. The sounds of conversation, The movement of pedestrians and the distant hum of traffic all felt slightly different, as if the street itself had experienced a brief moment of heightened awareness. The encounter with the young man and the guard had created a vivid memory, one that would remain in the protagonist's mind for a long time. The young man, meanwhile, began to process the events in his own way. Although he had been bold, loud, and restless, he now had the opportunity to reflect on how his behavior had been perceived and managed. The handcuffs, the calm authority of the guard, and the composed stance of the protagonist all contributed to a lesson in patience, restraint, and the consequences of one's actions. It was an experience that, while challenging, had ultimately been handled with professionalism and care. Back on the street, the protagonist paused near a small cafe, taking a moment to sit and observe the city around them. People passed by, going about their daily routines, unaware of the brief but dramatic event that had unfolded just moments earlier. The protagonist smiled quietly, thinking about the absurdity of the sausage remark, the young man's loud provocations, and the calm authority that had transformed the situation from potential chaos into a controlled and memorable encounter. As they sipped a warm drink, the protagonist reflected on the power of observation, patience, and calmness. The young man's behavior had been unpredictable, energetic, and at times challenging, but it had also provided a vivid demonstration of human behavior, social dynamics, and the value of measured responses. The encounter, while unusual, had been resolved peacefully, leaving behind a story that was both entertaining and instructive. Finally, the protagonist rose from their seat, feeling a sense of closure. The young man's energy had been contained, the crowd had dispersed, and the street had returned to its usual rhythm. The memory of the event remained vivid, a reminder that even ordinary streets could become stages for unexpected drama, and that calm authority, composure, and patience could turn chaos into a lesson in self-control and human understanding. Walking away, the protagonist felt a quiet satisfaction. They had witnessed a moment of conflict, observed human behavior at its most restless, and seen it resolved without aggression. The young man, the guard, the crowd, and even the protagonist had played their parts in a brief but unforgettable scene, a reminder that sometimes the most dramatic events could unfold in the most ordinary places, leaving lasting impressions and subtle lessons for all involved. The day ended with the city returning to its normal rhythm. People continued with their routines, tourists captured photographs of the guards, and the sounds of the streets filled the air once more. The protagonist, reflecting on the unusual events of the day, felt a mixture of amusement, relief, and insight. It was a story that would be remembered, shared quietly among friends, and recalled with a smile. A story of boldness, calm authority, and the surprising ways in which human behavior could unfold in public spaces.